So the Bible passage I'd like us to consider, I'm probably thinking maybe 3 weeks on this, is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. At least that's the core verse here. So, therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. And the phrase here, really the key part of this verse that we're going to be looking at is this idea of we do not want to lose heart. Uh, that's what nobody wants. We don't want our hearts to be depleted. We don't want to lose heart. We don't want to be run down. Paul's talking about really the opposite of that. What we do want is, he says here at the end of the verse, we want to be renewed day by day. Instead of losing heart, we want to gain heart. We want to be renewed. We want to be encouraged. In fact, let me give you a picture that I want to use for this verse. I want you to kind of picture a fuel gauge for our heart. And all of our hearts have this. And notice, I don't have empty or full here. I have the words discouraged and encouraged. And that's because this word courage, we think of that word courage as, valor or bravery. We think of the soldier who will show valor under fire. We think of the fireman who bravely goes into the burning building. That's our idea of courage. But the actual root of that word courage is the Latin word for heart. Think of the Spanish word corazón for heart. Cor, that's the Latin word for heart. And so the original meaning of courage wasn't just bravery, but it meant the fortitude to stand up under difficult circumstances. And so we see that in our English words, discouraged and encouraged. And so the way I want us to think about this is when our hearts are depleted, when we lose heart, then we are discouraged, right? We're running on empty, and it's hard to go on. We feel the burdens of life, and what we want instead is we want to be encouraged. We want our hearts to be full. We want to have that strength to face difficult circumstances. And so that's what Paul's talking about here in 2 Corinthians 4:16 again. He says we don't lose heart. Instead, we're renewed day by day. And so that's really, as we look at this verse, we're asking ourselves, how can that apply to us? I don't want to be nobody wants to be discouraged. Nobody wants to lose heart. I want to be encouraged. I want to be renewed day by day. And so to help us kind of understand how Paul gets there, there are two really important little conjunctions I want us to pay attention to. So the first is the beginning of the verse here, this little word therefore. And what therefore is, it's a conjunction that ties this verse to what came before it. Right? So this is a clue that in order to understand how Paul gets to this point where he's encouraged, where he's not losing heart, we need to look at what he had to say before this. So he says, this is true, and this is true, and this is true. Therefore, we do not lose heart. These things that he's talking about, and we'll look at this next week, verses 8 through 15. These things are true. Therefore, we're being renewed day by day. And so that's what we'll be looking at next week. And if you want to kind of work ahead, you can look those verses up. But then there's another little conjunction here. I have to add the first word to verse 17 to the screen here. When we get to verse 17, he says, for this is true, and this is true, and this is true. And so because that little word for, that's what that means. It means because. And so Paul says we don't lose heart. We're being renewed day by day for these reasons. And so we're going to have to come and we're going to have to look at what he has to say in verse 17 and verse 18 in order to understand how not to lose heart. And so that's what we'll look at in 2 weeks from now. So that's the plan. We want to know how to be encouraged, not discouraged. And so we're going to look at what Paul has to say before this key verse, and we're going to look at what Paul has to say after this key verse. So there's one more thing then for us to look at in the verse, and that's the middle part of the verse, the part here where Paul talks about how outwardly we're wasting away. So the context, or I'd say the condition in which this verse is written, the context, the condition in which our hearts exist is that we run towards decay, that we are wasting away. This is really kind of a fundamental belief of Christianity. Ever since the fall, ever since Adam and Eve committed sin in the Garden of Eden and God subjected creation to futility, it's been our understanding that the world is subject to death, to disease, to disorder. And so part of the condition in which we live our lives, part of the condition in which our hearts exist is that the tendency is for us to run towards discouragement. The circumstances in which we live tend to work towards disorder. Sometimes as Christians we act surprised when things aren't as good as we would hope they would be. I think especially living where we do in history with all of the advancements we've made as a society. So with all of our technology and with all of our relative wealth compared to the generations that came before us, with all of our medical advancements and our success against polio and malaria and measles and that sort of thing, we just sort of have this sort of idea that things should get better. And so a virus comes along that no one's seen before, and globally we're crippled by this pandemic, or when problems in society that have been around for so long don't get resolved, things like racism or conflict in the Middle East, and we wonder, well, why don't things get better? Why isn't it fixed? When we receive a diagnosis that our own bodies are breaking down, cancer or diabetes, and we wonder, well, why is this happening to me? Why don't things keep getting better? Well, our understanding as Christians is that that's part of living in this world. Outwardly, we're wasting away. Our bodies are subject to decay. It's not even just a Christian idea. The world of physics, the second law of thermodynamics says that left on their own, any system is naturally going to decline and disorder, that energy dissipates, that sandcastles crumble, weeds grow, bodies break down. Or think of it as Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. That's the conditions in which we live. And so we think about that fuel gauge for our hearts, and we don't want to be discouraged, but that's the direction life tends to go. But the good news of this verse and what we're going to be looking at for the next couple of weeks is Paul says it's possible for us not to lose heart. It's possible for us to be encouraged, to be renewed day by day. And obviously that truth lies in Jesus. And so that's what we'll be looking at the next couple of weeks.